Welcome into another Week 12 Thursday Night Football. This just so happens to be on Thanksgiving Day. We have 3 games going on. We've got the Packers taking on the Lions, the Commanders taking on the Cowboys, and the 49ers taking on the Seahawks. I'm going to be breaking down each and every one of these games to kind of signal out which ones are going to be fantasy relevant. That way you can make the ultimate lineup for this week. Sit back, let's get it. Let's break down the Packers and the Lions. Now, first on the Packers side, the top fantasy players, in my opinion, are quarterback Jordan Love, wide receiver Romeo Doubs, and wide receiver Jayden Reed. For starters, let's talk about Jordan Love. Now, Love finally gave us a 300-yard passing game last week. It is something that he really can repeat? That's really the question that we're asking here. He has plenty of weapons out there to give us consistency fantasy outings. He just needs to put it together. The Lions have really struggled against opposing quarterbacks, ranking 25th in the NFL. Now, there is an opportunity here for Love to go back-to-back 300-yard passing games. He looks good this week. Now let's move on to Romeo Doubs here. Now Doubs has had he's been a real big touchdown type of guy this season, scoring a touchdown in 4 of his last 5 games. The Lions ranked 22nd against opposing wide receivers, so there is a path for success here. If Love plans on having another solid outing, he needs Doubs to be there making plays for him. So Doubs should be pretty solid this week. Next, we're talking about Jayden Reed. Now, Reed has been consistent for fantasy rosters, as of late, but Reed has seen 5 or more targets in 3 of the last 4 weeks. So Reed is a perfect type of flex play for your roster. He isn't expected to land you 20 plus fantasy points week in and week out, but he does have a safe floor of around 10 fantasy points, and that's really what you're looking for, especially in a flex spot. So Reed should be started in all leagues. Now let's go ahead and switch gears and move over here to the Lions. The top fantasy players from this team, in my opinion, are quarterback Jared Goff, running back David Montgomery, running back Jahmyr Gibbs, and wide receiver Amon-Ra St. Brown, and then at the last, tight end Sam Laporta. First, we're going to talk about Jared Goff here. Goff may scare some people with him throwing those 3 interceptions last week, but I'm here to say, fret not, my friends. Even with the Packers ranking 7th against opposing quarterbacks, Goff has been in his game. He's just been really on his game all season long. He's not my favorite play by any means, but this week, he's serviceable, and if you're forced to be playing Goff, you aren't really panicking at this point. So Goff has the tools here to have a very good fantasy day. So Goff is definitely a start for me this week. Next, we move over here to David Montgomery. Now, Montgomery has scored a touchdown in every game he has played in except for 1 week. So he has had an absolute monster of a season, mostly due to the positive game scripts that the Lions have been in thus far this season. Montgomery has been able to keep highly touted rookie Gibbs on the sideline for most part. Montgomery, he's a very solid play this week. Now let's go ahead and talk about Jahmyr Gibbs. Gibbs has been hindered with Montgomery really back from injury, but Gibbs still has that breakaway ability to make some things kind of happen. So it's difficult to bench Gibbs, so he needs to be into your lineup. Don't expect the type of production that you're used to with Montgomery out of the action, but he should have a nice flex play appeal for you this week with such a high ceiling that Gibbs does have. Moving on here to Amon-Ra St. Brown. St. Brown is one of the best PPR receivers in the NFL right now. If you're in a PPR league, then there's really no analysis needed here. He's a monster and he gets a buttload of work. So Goff seems to be locked in on St. Brown, and I can see why. The route running and the hands of St. Brown really just makes him one of the best wide receivers in the game, and it's not even close. So St. Brown is a set it and forget it for me for the rest of the season. So I don't care what the matchup is. Last but not least, the fantasy players that I'm really watching from this game on Thanksgiving football would be Sam Laporta. So Laporta cooled off a bit last week, having 3 receptions for 18 yards, but Laporta's a tight end that can really put up some numbers in this offense on any given week. Definitely not a top tight end in my rankings this week, but if he's on your team, you probably don't have a better option, so you can definitely start Laporta this week. He shouldn't be too bad. Just like there's players that I would target in this game for fantasy football, there's also some players that could be having some type of sleeper appeal if you're in a pinch. So for the Packers, I can see A.J. Dillon and Christian Watson as fantasy viable in this matchup. Now, there's a good chance that Aaron Jones doesn't play and A.J. Dillon is next to really step up. Dillon's a big back who can really get you those hard-nosed yards, and against a stout Lions defense, it's just not the best matchup. If the Packers are going to win this game, they need to attack this Lions defense through the air, and that's where Christian Watson comes in. So he's supposed to be the number 1 wide receiver on this offense, but he's just a meh kind of play. He does, however, have the talent to go bananas on any given week. With that said, he does have potential to to be fantasy viable. For the Lions, I can see Jameson Williams having some fantasy appeal this week. Now, Williams had, such high expectations this season. He's done absolutely nothing with the opportunity so far. So he hasn't really had more than 2 catches in a game yet, and I don't have high expectations this week either. So I do, however, realize that Williams has the ability to hit that home run on any given play, which is why he's in my sleepers list. Play with caution this week. Now let's go ahead and break down the Washington Commanders and the Dallas Cowboys. First on the Commanders side, the top fantasy players in my opinion are wide receiver Terry McLaurin and tight end Logan Thomas. For starters, let's talk about Terry McLaurin. Now McLaurin has been the epitome of consistent this season. He has had 5 or more receptions in 8 of 11 games yet this season. So let's just face it at this point, the Commanders really aren't good, and they're going to need to pass the ball quite a bit just to attempt to keep pace with some of these teams that they're facing. McLaurin's benefiting from being the number 1 wide receiver on such a bad team. McLaurin should be a good start this week. Now let's move over here to Logan Thomas, and Thomas is the only other really bright spot on this offense. He is by no means a must-have type of a player, but Thomas has had at least 4 receptions in the past 5 games. He's a big part of this offense, and against the Cowboys, they're going to need him to come up big if they want to have a chance. If you're in need of a tight end, Thomas could be in play. Keep him on your radar. Now let's go ahead and switch gears. Move over here to the Cowboys. The top fantasy players in this team, for my opinion, would be quarterback Dak Prescott, wide receiver CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver Brandon Cooks, and tight end Jake Ferguson. First, we're going to talk about Dak Prescott. So Prescott has been running all cylinders, on this offense. He's just been clicking. It's great to see what Prescott's able to do. Prescott's really been on a tear these past 4 weeks. Last week, he wasn't needed to really throw 300 yards, but looked every bit of the part of a top quarterback. Look for Prescott to get back to his stellar stat line against the Commanders defense this week. So Prescott will look to give fantasy owners something to really smile about on Thanksgiving Day. Next, let's move over here to CeeDee Lamb. Lamb isn't going to be happy with his performance last week, and we'll look to really get back on track this week. It really wasn't Lamb's fault, though. The Cowboys didn't really need him to dominate the Panthers. Lamb took a backseat as they cruised to victory. So just knowing how serious Lamb takes football, he surely just approached Dak and had a conversation about him getting the ball. So I look for Lamb to show out this week. Now we talk about Brandon Cooks here. Now Cooks has been like a box of chocolates this season. You just never know what you're going to get. One week you get 173 yards and a touchdown. The next you get 7 yards total. So I have to put Cooks in my recommendations just because of such a high ceiling, but I know it can be volatile. But if you're trying to win, sometimes having a boom or bust player in your lineup can be beneficial. Cooks is a good flex this week. Last but not least, for the fantasy players that I'm watching in this game on Thanksgiving football would be Jake Ferguson. Now, Ferguson has been relatively dependable as a fantasy tight end thus far this season. You always have the chance for a touchdown, reception with Ferguson in your lineup. So he is by no means a top 10 tight end, but he can get the job done in a pinch. Ferguson should be fine this week as your tight end. Start him with confidence. Just like I previously stated, there are some players in this game that I'd like for fantasy, but there's also some sleepers that you could be looking out for this game as well if you're in a pinch or even somebody for a flex spot. For the Commanders, I can see Sam Howell, Brian Robinson Jr., and Jahan Dotson as fantasy viable in this matchup. I usually have Howell and Robinson in my recommendation section, but against this Cowboys defense, I just see both of them just having a very difficult time to be a must start. So they can both be fantasy viable, but I wouldn't bet on it. As for Jahan Dotson, he has the talent to be good, just doesn't have the opportunities. He could always come down with a 30-yard touchdown, but again, something I wouldn't bet on. For the Cowboys, I can see Tony Pollard and Michael Gallup having fantasy appeal this week as well. Pollard would definitely be a start here, but he just isn't getting the workload we expected. Are you benching Pollard? No, but I just want to be on the record here saying that I don't like his opportunities. Even against a team that they blew out in the Panthers, Pollard had 12 carries for 61 yards and a touchdown. Mind you, he had a 22-yard run. So, if you take that 1 carry away from his total, it was 11 carries for 39 yards. I just don't like what, he's given fantasy owners at the moment. And then Michael Gallup, he's all right if you want to throw him into your flex, but this offense is just so potent that Gallup does have the chance to catch a few balls and have a decent outing for you. Now, for the last game here, let's go ahead and break down the 49ers and the Seahawks. First on the 49ers side, top fantasy players, in my opinion, are quarterback Brock Purdy, running back Christian McCaffrey, wide receiver Brandon Ayuk, wide receiver Deebo Samuel, and tight end George Kittle. For starters, let's talk about Brock Purdy. Purdy's been an absolute surgical, just a surgical beast on the field here lately. Now that Deebo Samuel's back in action, he's really starting to look like his old self. So the entire offense is just clicking together, and they're just a true force to be reckoned with. Purdy is one of those quarterbacks you're sure to be able to get stupid late in your drafts, and it's really paying off big time for you. Look for Purdy to have yet another solid fantasy outing for your team this week. Now let's move over here to Christian McCaffrey. McCaffrey's seeing a large amount of carries in this backfield, and rightfully so. I mean, he's one of the best running backs in the NFL right now. So if you have McCaffrey, you don't need any analysis from me or anyone here on YouTube to tell you to start this guy. McCaffrey's a freak of nature on football field. Just get him in your lineup. Next, we're talking about Brandon Ayuk. Now, Ayuk gets completely stripped Deebo Samuel from that number one wide receiver on this team. Ayuk has been a man-child out there, making some spectacular catches, catch after catch. So Ayuk threw up another 156 yards receiving last week and giving fantasy owners something to cheer about. So Ayuk is a must start in all leagues. Moving right along here to Deebo Samuel. Samuel's been a letdown, really, in my opinion, thus far this season. In most leagues, he was drafted ahead of Brandon Ayuk and just simply hasn't lived up to those expectations that everybody had for him. So we aren't seeing the rushing upside we're used to, and all the targets are now, what it was last season. But you have to start Samuel if you have him in your lineups, but you're not by no means excited to have him on your fantasy team. He should put out an okay stat line this week, but expectations for anything more than that would just be a letdown. So just start Samuel. It is what it is. Look the other way and have fun with it. So now let's go ahead and talk about George Kittle. As I mentioned during the offseason, Kittle is classified in my book as a boom or bust tight end. Last week I saw a nice boom game from him with 8 receptions, 89 yards, and a touchdown. Kittle is a set it and forget it type, week in and week out player, with the understanding that there are going to be some weeks here where he just completely disappears. This week, however, I believe he comes through for fantasy owners and gives you a very big stat line. Now let's go ahead and switch on gears, move over here to the Seahawks. The top fantasy players in this team, in my opinion, would be quarterback Geno Smith, running back Zach Charbonnet, and wide receiver DK Metcalf, along with wide receiver Tyler Lockett. First, we'll talk about Geno Smith here. Smith left last week with an arm injury that had Drew Lock finishing the game. Head coach Pete Carroll said when he was asked about Smith's availability for this Thursday, and I quote, "He's gonna play." So by all means, it looks like Geno Smith will be good to go based on that information. So I think Geno Smith's going to have a difficult time really handling this 49ers defense. But on the bright side, he's going to need to throw the ball quite a bit to keep pace with the 49ers. Given the circumstances alone, Smith should be fine this week, so feel confident with him in your lineup. Next, we move over here to Zach Charbonnet. Charbonnet took over for the injured Kenneth Walker last week, and he really did an exceptional job. 15 carries, 47 yards, along with 6 receptions for 22 yards. So it doesn't look like Walker is going to be able to suit up for this game as of the recording of this video. So Charbonnet should get a chance to show what he can do here. The bad part is that he gets to show us that against this daunting defense. So don't hold your breath with this one, but I do feel excited that Charbonnet possesses the skill to be productive here. I would say that, Charbonnet is still a start, even though his task to be a good fantasy player is quite large. So now we're going to talk about DK Metcalf. Metcalf finally giving fantasy owners something to cheer about last week when he had 5 receptions for 94 yards and a touchdown. So I know 53 of those yards came on one play, but you got to get them where you can, nowadays in fantasy football. So the Seattle offense hasn't really been what it's been last season, but they'll still be able to put up some nice stat lines from time to time. And this week could be one of those against a really tough 49ers defense. But against this defense, the Seahawks are really going to need to throw the ball often to even keep pace with these guys. Look for Metcalf to receive plenty of opportunity this week. Get him in your lineup. Last but not least, for the fantasy players that I'm really watching for this week on fantasy football would be Tyler Lockett. Lockett's another one of those boomer bust type of players that we enjoy having in our lineups. We love him one week and we hate him the next. This week he goes against the 49ers defense that can be beaten deep. So I do like Lockett's chances this week to give you a solid stat line. You guys know the drill. There are some players that I do like for fantasy in this game, but there's also some players that I like as sleepers. Let me go over these guys so that way in case you need somebody for that flex spot, you can put them right on in. For the 49ers, I can't see really anyone else being fantasy viable in this matchup. I mean, the 49ers have key players at each position who contribute, and no one else really makes a dent on the fantasy radar. For the Seahawks, I can see Jackson Smith and Jigba having some fantasy appeal this week. The problem with Jackson Smith and Jigba is that it really isn't his skill. He has plenty of that. It's that he has 2 stud wide receivers ahead of him chewing up all that playing time. So it's possible for Smith and Jigba to give you a solid outing on any given week, but I can't recommend someone somebody to you guys that, doesn't really have a safer floor than what he has. If you're in a pinch, Smith and Jigba will do, but I'm not really excited about it. At the end of the day, anybody can go off and become fantasy relevant, but it's ultimately up to you to decide who to put into your lineups. As always, I appreciate you guys watching through the video. I know this one was probably a little bit longer than what you guys are used to for Thursday Night Football, but we had 3 games to go over for Thanksgiving. I can't wait to see you guys on the next video. You guys have a happy Thanksgiving.